Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 9 game from the Charlotte Summer GMIM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 8 video, you know that I won my second game in a row against Grandmaster Karen Gregorian, and all of a sudden I was back on 50%, which was a huge deal, considering that in my 7th round game I was nearly teetering on -3, and then all of a sudden I won that game, and it kind of kicked me back into overdrive, and I found another gear and was able to kind of, win my second game in a row. So essentially, sometimes the wins come in bunches, and just that little bit of momentum I got was huge for my morale and for my rating. So really being on 50% score, I was thrilled because it meant that I wouldn't really be losing points from the event. Because everyone's pretty much an IM or GM strength. So, if you're on 50%, you pretty much net out at about even. My opponent in the last round, in this 9th round, was IM-elect Tianqi Wang. And he's actually someone from the North Carolina area that I know fairly decently, because there was a time when I actually was working with him as he was a student of mine, and I helped him a little bit with his game. Now, I can't take full credit. I mean, he's certainly a great player in his own right, and he put in a lot of work. But there is a familiarity between us because we had sort of shared ideas for a time. Now, when that happens, then there is that great familiarity. There's always a question about how to approach it, not from the standpoint of whether to play or not. For me, I'm always going to try to play games no matter what, but just from the standpoint of surprising, like, because there's a decent amount of familiarity, it's kind of like, how to surprise your opponent and make sure they, you get something that they don't necessarily expect. And so that was my challenge in this one. In any case, after winning 2 in a row, I was feeling pretty ambitious, and I thought this is a really good opportunity to, win another game, a 3rd game in a row, and end the tournament on +1 all of a sudden. And that was kind of my mindset going into it, even with black. So anyways, let's get into it. So Tianqi opened with D4. I played D6, and that's already a little bit of an unusual move from me, but kind of showing the willingness to play with dynamics in this one, because I was pretty hell-bent on trying to get a W here. C4 was now played, and C4 to me is a move, but I always felt like this was a slight inaccuracy against D6, and the reason for that is you pretty much allow black to play E5 unscathed. Note that this endgame after D takes E5, Queen takes D8, King takes D8 is considered to be very, very decent for black, in part because of the critical squares along the D file. Basically, because white has already played C4, he's chronically weakened the D4 square. So the issue is that white doesn't really have a great way to cover it again, because if you go E3, then you weaken the D3 square. So essentially, there's this problem with the D4 and D3 squares that make this position kind of difficult for white to play. On the flip side, if you look at black's squares, the D5 square can be easily controlled with C6. And then the difference in this structure is that the black king can actually even go to C7 or E8, but in either case, the D6 square is also well covered. So the point is that the D5 and D6 squares are well covered for black, but D3 and D4 are not well covered for white. And that's why this endgame has quite a decent reputation for black. So really, that's why I don't think C4 is a great move, because if you're not going to go for this endgame after D5, D5, then you're pretty much allowing black to take space in the middle that's unnecessary. And so if really I knew to play D6 because I figured that Tianqi is probably not going to go for E4. He's not an E4 player necessarily, even though this is probably the most principled move, but it makes it an E4. It makes it a perk defense, which he might not have had a lot of experience against. Given you don't want to play E4, or he didn't want to play E4, Knight F3 is the move I would recommend, just because you stop E5 in its tracks, at least for now, because now you have 2 pieces on that square. So anyways, instead C4 is played, and I went E5, and Tianqi went E3, which I believe is extremely, extremely modest, too modest actually, and just kind of passive and not necessarily in the spirit of a white opening. I now went g6, kind of still sort of full-throated, trying to get this type of dynamic line, not really minding this recapture on e5 still. And after knight f3, I went bishop g7, still kind of welcoming this exchange on e5, keeping this pawn tension. I also could have played e4. That was also an option, but I thought, keeping the tension would be a little bit more to my liking, and I thought that he would be relatively eager to play like a reverse French. So if I played e4, he might go knight d2, or maybe even knight g1 back. And even though I've taken the space in the center, I've kind of relieved the tension a little bit and allow white a free hand on the queen side. So I didn't want to go for that. Anyways, after bishop g7, bishop e2 was played. And now I probably should have thought about e4 again, but again, I just was reluctant to go e4, knight fd2, f5, and go for the structure where it seems like it's a little bit more of a race in the closed position, where I'm trying to get something going on the king side, whereas white will try to play on the queen side. And I just didn't want to have that type of race from this early point in the game, especially because I wasn't super familiar with this structure. So I just decided to keep it more in the spirit of a traditional King's Indian as opposed to closing the center. So anyways, after bishop e2, I went knight d7. Note that I can't go knight f6 because that kind of hangs the pawn on e5. So that's why I have to start with knight d7 first. And now knight c3 is played. And after knight gf6, castles. And this position actually is just a King's Indian attack reversed. So white is essentially playing like a black opening, where he's basically playing the black side of the King's Indian attack, but he has a tempo up. So it's a position that should be, relatively close to equal. And it's actually a quite complicated and dynamic position from the standpoint that normally black does try to close the center with e4, and white does try to play b4, b5, and chip away at black's queen side. And again, I understand that this is the type of position that could happen, but I was relatively reluctant to go for, the closed positions because I didn't know the attacking idea super, super well. Like I know, you go e4, queen e7, rook e8, h5, knight f8, and then you try to spin this knight around to g5 and go h4, h3. But I just knew that takes a lot of moves, essentially. I just rattled off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 moves to get that type of position I'm talking about with all those maneuvers. And in the interim, I was a little bit wary of white going b4, let's say b4, a4, bishop a3, b5, c5. It just seemed like black needed more moves to get off the initiative on the king side than white needed to get off the initiative on the queen side. And so I was reluctant to kind of enter that race. So instead, I decided to keep the tension in the center. And this was actually just another way to play. It's not necessarily the most correct way, but it's just another way to play the position. So anyways, after I castled, white went rook b1, kind of already introducing the theme of playing b4. And I think it is kind of a smart waiting move, kind of, again, goading me into playing e4, but I just wasn't really into it. So instead, I just played rook e8, another normal waiting move. And I think the thing that I like about rook e8 is the flexibility. I could still potentially go e4 at some juncture, but the point is I can also go e takes e4. I can spin the knight around to f8 at some point. And rook e8 is just a flexible move that I'm going to have to do in either variation, however I decide to handle the center. So the idea is that, I keep my options open. After rook e8, white went rook e1, another waiting move, if you will. And I wasn't too sure what white's purpose was with rook e1 and with respect to the position that would happen after e4 with the closed center. But maybe there's some merit to a bishop coming into f1 or even a knight popping to f1 to overprotect the h2 pawn. So maybe there is some merit to it. Now, rook e1 does make a lot of sense if I wind up playing e takes d4, because after e takes, the rook would be, ready to challenge my rook on e8. So, I think it's just another layer of some high-level prophylaxis. After rook e1, I decided to go b6 because I still was not keen on playing the closed center. And you could just see the kind of gamesmanship that's going on where we're both kind of waiting on each other to budge. And yeah, it's a funny game we're playing. After b6, Tianqi went b4, and now we still are pretty much not resolving the tension in the center. But I thought b4 kind of made the position a little bit more critical, just from the standpoint that now white is trying to crash through on the queen side, maybe with c5, maybe going to go queen b3 and bishop b2. And I thought that I would have to do something in the next 3 or 4 moves to kind of, offset white's play on the queen side. And typically when white's playing on the flank, or any side is playing on the flank, you want to play through the middle. So I decided that was probably my best bet. And I went a5 first. The reason I went a5 first is just to kind of undermine this pawn on b4. Note if you play b5, the break on c5 is slowed down quite a bit. So after a5, white actually went a3. And the point was that after a takes b4, all of a sudden I traded one of the pawns that he maybe was going to use to kind of, as a battering ram. And I've opened up the A file for my rook so that I could be a potential threat along that second rank at some point. So sometimes when you do lack space, it's a good idea to trade your A pawn just so the rook does get activated, and that was basically my idea there. After A takes b4, I went bishop b7 now, and maybe this was actually a slight mistake. The computer was suggesting e takes d4, and the idea is this move actually takes advantage, in conjunction with the next move, takes advantage of this knight on c3 being loose as a consequence of b4, so that after e takes d4, I can play knight e4 and trade off these knights. And when you have a space disadvantage, you do want to trade a pair of minor pieces, so this would accomplish that task. And yeah, I think black would be fine now that the bishop is also coming out here and on that diagonal, and this one will pop out to b7 or maybe even to f5 in some lines. And yeah, black shouldn't have serious problems. So yeah, maybe I should have played e takes d4 first. Instead, I went bishop b7, keeping the tension even longer. And after bishop b2, now I took on d4. I thought it was the right time. My bishop was lined up. My knight was ready to hop into e4, and I was really attracted to the idea of going knight e4 and recapturing with the bishop. I thought that was a nice consideration. But also recapturing with the rook is decent as well. For instance, if e takes d4, knight takes, rook takes. Black is quite a decent position here. But note that bishop takes e4 is also nice because I hit the rook on b1. So in any case, I think black is more or less okay in any position here. Note that this bishop on g7, eyeing the bishop on b2, I would argue the one on g7 is a little bit more secure than the one on b2 because the d pawn is pinned in some positions. So I think that this stare down that's happening is actually in black's favor. Now, instead of playing e takes d4 after e takes d4, white actually played knight takes d4, and that move came as a surprise to me, and I believe it is a slight mistake. And the reason I believe that is because now you're pretty much ceding control of the e5 square and the e4 square for my minor pieces. Now, the reason I say e5 and e4, is because if this e pawn were on d4 like on the other line, it'd be covering e5. So clearly that would be under white's control. But the other huge issue is that this e4 square now can be occupied potentially, and there are 3 pieces of mine that are just eyeing that square. Whereas if e takes d4 was played, once this bishop moved potentially to d3 or to f1, probably d3, white will have had firm control over that square himself, and he would have been able to contest on e4. And so even though this position I was saying is equal-ish, I just feel that playing knight takes d4 cedes 2 very important squares that are highways for which my minor pieces can activate. And because of that, after knight takes e4, I went knight e4 very quickly. And you could see here that I'm already making use of the fact that e4 is a little bit sensitive. After knight e4, white actually went bishop f1. And again, I just think this move is a little bit too cautious in my opinion. I understand his intent to maybe overprotect g2, but I don't think you can allow my minor pieces to sit on these central squares, because all of a sudden I have very, very dangerous threats. And yeah, actually, instead of bishop f1, I think a move like knight takes e4 was probably warranted just to get rid of that knight right away. After bishop takes e4, rook a1, and you start to trade off some pieces, and it's not totally the end of the world. Although I should say here c5 might be a distinct possibility, taking advantage of this pin on the diagonal. So maybe it's not so clear. Maybe it's not as clear as I thought, because this is actually a huge threat. So maybe he can't take on e4. Maybe he has to start with a move like, maybe knight d5 is playable. I'm not sure. And maybe in this position he's able to, stabilize and hold on. Although I would play knight df6 probably and just evict this knight on d5. Note that I don't want to play c6 necessarily, because it kind of weakens my whole construction, all my pawns here. So I don't really want to do that, but maybe that's even playable. The point is that this knight on e4 should not be tolerated for a long period of time. And after bishop f1, I actually have quite a few opportunities to kind of take advantage of my knight being on e4. One of them is c5. I didn't play this, but the idea is actually that this knight and this bishop on g7 are bearing down on the knight on c3. So if the d knight moves, there might be some tactical problems on the c3 knight. So after, a few exchanges and the knight comes back to e2, the only way to really protect it, now I can go for a move like, knight e5, and all of a sudden you could see my pieces really converging through the middle of the board. And I think black has a little bit of an initiative here. So that would have been one possibility. Another possibility is actually I could have gone queen g5 and got my queen to really menacing outpost. But I was reluctant in these variations where after knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop g7, bishop b1, I wind up winning an exchange, but I'm not so sure how great the exchange is, because I have really, really weak dark squares, and I think white has pretty decent compensation here for the exchange. So I was reluctant to engage in this type of variation, even though the computer is saying that it's, a little bit better for black. I'm not really buying it. But that was another possibility. I also could have played knight e5 right away, which, also, instead of brushing with c5, just bring the knight to e5. And again, these knights are very, very dangerous here. If f3, I could just take on c3 and just go knight takes f3 all of a sudden. And you could see just the tactics flowing in the position, because the knight is pinned on d4. Of course, the queen can't capture. And so g takes f3 is the only move. But now queen g5 check is a huge move, because after bishop g2, I can go rook takes c3. And you have a position here where I'm actually a piece down, but I have two pawns for it, and quite the initiative with my rook potentially activating on the A file, my bishops both pointing at the king, and my queen in an active position. This would also be a very, very tough position for white to handle. So, yeah, there are definitely some options there, and I definitely did not see all of these options in the depth that I've just displayed to you now. But I was already thinking that, if my knights were centralized like this, I might have attacking chances on the king side. And that's why I actually opted for the move h5. And the idea was, in some lines, to potentially use the H pawn as a battering ram to undermine White's king side. For instance, if I'm able to force out a weakness, maybe the G pawn moves and the long diagonal gets open. I thought that would be a nice proposition. And in some lines, I just thought that taking more space on the king side would be appropriate. And in the meantime, I just keep the tension. I thought this would be a really nice way to play. And remarkably, on the very next move, White actually blundered, because the move Rook A1 was played, and this is actually a losing move. Amazing that this move is a losing move, and I'll show you why in a moment. But a better move would have been Queen C2. It's funny, this move connects the rooks, and that's actually the move that would have been the best one to play. But it also protects the F2 pawn, which we'll see in a moment is actually quite sensitive, and another reason why the knight on E4 is so well centralized. The issue with Rook A1 is that after Rook takes A1, which I played, and Bishop takes A1, now I amazingly have the tactical shot Knight takes F2, and all of a sudden, amazingly, White is just lost, because if you play King takes F2, I can play Queen H4 check, and the issue is that if the king steps back to G1, I take on D4, and you can't recapture on D4 because I'm hitting the E1 rook, and I just win in exchange in addition to the pawns I already picked up. So yeah, it's actually just completely winning. And the real difference is that Rook A1 actually trades off a defender of the rook on E1, and so it just leaves them tactically vulnerable. But I think it's quite a remarkable line, considering that it just seemingly comes out of nowhere, but it's really because of the centralized knight on E4, and really because I pried open the A file with A5 and A takes B4 earlier in the game. So it's funny how when all your pieces are kind of working in concert, tactics just appear. But just to note, if Rook takes E1, even if White played Queen takes A1 instead of Bishop takes A1, Knight takes F2 is still effective, because if their King takes Queen H4, there's still the problem of the Rook on E1 being sensitive. So, and note that a move like G3, which maybe aims to try and challenge the Queen so that it's not hitting E1, can be well met by Rook takes E3. And amazingly, after G takes H4, Rook E1 is checkmate. These bishops are just wheeling and dealing on those diagonals. And here's a funny line. After Rook takes E3, let's say you try to move the knight somewhere to challenge the bishop on B2. Now Rook takes G3 is double discovery checkmate. So you could just see how these bishops working in concert along the long diagonal are just lethal. And it's really because of those central squares that White essentially gave up. So anyways, after Rook A1 bishop takes, and Knight F2, White did not take on F2 because he saw that tactic, and it pretty much goes downhill pretty quickly from there if you do that, and instead went for the move Queen D2, which threatens the knight on F2 and maybe tries to recapture with the queen. Note that before the Rook A1 blunder, he should have played Queen C2 to protect the rooks, and basically the idea with doing that would have been also to protect the F2 pawn. So just a little bit late, too little too late, frankly, in terms of defending the king side, but what can you do? Here, I thought for a little while, and I was trying to figure out what the best course of action would be, because I looked at the position and I calculated maybe for 20 minutes here, trying to make the move Knight H3 check work. And the point is that if G takes at H3, I can just go Queen G5. And so if G takes H3, Queen G5 check, all of a sudden this is just winning very easily, because if Bishop G2, I can play Bishop takes D4, and you can't recapture on D4 with the E pawn because the queen is hanging, and you can't capture with the queen because Queen takes G2 would be mate. So I thought this would be a really, really promising line. But the reason I didn't ultimately play, and I was worried about this line, was actually king h1. And even though my knight is immune here, I just couldn't figure out like a tactical follow-up that would end the game, and I was a little bit worried about having loose pieces. But it turns out here that the position is winning on the spot if you find the right move. And the move is actually just knight f6, just bringing my other knight into the attack. And amazingly, knight g4 to f2 is mate. So white has to try and shut down the diagonal some way to deal with this threat, but there's just no easy way to do it. One thing that I missed is that I thought knight d5 was an opportunity to kind of block the diagonal, but now knight e4 comes with tempo and just threatens knight f2 mate, so it just doesn't work. And so the knight can't block the diagonal, and if the knight on c3 can't block the diagonal, you might say, well, what about e4? Another way to block the diagonal. Unfortunately for white, rook takes a e4 is an amazing shot here, and it's again based upon the fact that after takes, this knight f2 thing is a huge threat. So white has to give the exchange back, and now I'm just up 2 pawns with the same knight on h3 still on the square, doing a fantastic job, and my bishop on e4 just unopposed on the diagonal with a, fairly easily winning position. So really I just kind of missed this important detail that there was no effective way to block the diagonal, and I could bring my other knight into the attack with decisive effect, and that would have won much, much quicker. Instead, I didn't see this line, and because of that, I actually just decided to go back. And my rationale was, look, I've won a pawn, and in addition to winning a pawn, I also have a much better pawn structure now, because now white has 3 pawn islands, and in particular, the e3 pawn will be a serious target. So I thought, really, I'm a pawn up, but also have a much better position. This should be promising for me, even just a pawn up. So I thought, okay, I still have to convert, but I'm pretty decent at that. So after knight e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, I'm only a pawn up, but I still have a great position. White now went knight b5. I think this is a good move, trying to get this knight to an active post and essentially trade off these bishops, because my bishop on g7 was doing a lot more than the bishop on a1 was, and in some lines I might pop out to h6 to challenge the e3 pawn. So it makes sense to try and trade those bishops. And because of that, I played knight e5, refusing that trade because I figured my bishop was the stronger piece. Now rook d1 was played. Reasonable move. I think in some lines trying to play for c5 and just trying to get some counterplay on the queen side, because the king side structure is so bad, he's pretty much frozen from the h to the e file. There's just nothing going on those files for white, so he's trying to play on d to a on the second half of the board. I now went queen e7, just getting out of the way of potential c5 breaks, and in some lines lining up my pieces against e3. And now white went h3, overprotecting the g4 square, because knight g4 was going to be a potential possibility. I went bishop b7 now, just bringing that bishop back, and it's again some prophylaxis, because I thought that maybe knight c3 would be an idea, just challenging my bishop. So I thought, before it's attacked, let me just back it up. And now white went bishop d4, overprotecting e3. And here I went for bishop h6. And this was essentially my idea, to line up my pieces against the weak pawn in the position, because I thought if e3 drops, I'll have 2 pawns up and it'll be very easy to convert. And now after queen c3, white gets out of the pin on the e3 pawn. The queen steps out of that diagonal, but the e3 pawn is still a massive target. And I figured, okay, if I get rid of this bishop on d4, I'll be able to get at e3. So I decided to play the move knight c6. Now c5 was also an option, trying to get at this bishop on d4, but I was reluctant to give this knight and rook the counterplay on the d6 pawn, so I just didn't want to allow that activity, and that's why I rejected that line. I was looking at stuff like b takes e5, let's say d takes c5, bishop e5, queen e5, takes. And yeah, this position is actually totally winning. I don't even know what I'm talking about because bishop takes e3 comes with check. But for some reason, I just did not want this knight to come into d6. So I was reluctant to play that move. And I thought that if I play knight c6, I secure the two bishops without ruining my pawn structure. So that was my thought process. But this actually allows bishop f6, and the point is that now white actually keeps the bishop and puts it on a very, very active outpost and is willing to jettison the e3 pawn for activity. And I saw this, but I thought, well, I'm not really buying this because I'm going to win a second pawn. I'm going to force the queens off the board, and b4 is going to be hanging. So I thought, nah, I got this. So I went queen takes e3, and after this trade and king h1, I just went rook c8. And the point was I'm overtaking the c7 pawn, which holds my whole chain together. And now I'm attacking the pawn on b4, which would be a third pawn. So this should be lost. White now went rook e1, trying to go for maximum activity. And I went bishop d2, challenging this rook on e1 and trying to recapture on b4. Rook e2, and bishop takes b4. And now black went knight takes c7, and this was, or excuse me, white went knight takes c7, and this was this big idea, frankly, was that by keeping this rook on the e file and having the bishop on f6, there's a nasty mating construction on h8 if my king steps to h7 and I take this rook, and I take this knight on c7. So clearly I was not going to do that, and I saw that I was losing, one of my pawns. But the point is, I'm still 2 pawns up, and I thought, well, this shouldn't be a huge difficulty converting. So I decided to play knight e5 and essentially block the rook on the file. And the point is now I'm attacking the knight on c7. My bishop is, on a long diagonal, and I'm kind of locking the bishop out in some ways. The bishop on f6 is kind of an attacking piece, but also can be challenged with knight d7. So this kind of forces white's hand, and you have to deal with the c7 knight. So knight b5 was played. Note that if knight d5 was played, trying knight e7, I would have just taken. And the point is that after this capture, I can go rook c1, and the bishop on f1 will drop, because if king g1, I have bishop c5 check. And if rook f2, well, I still have bishop c5, and the rook is going to run out of squares on this diagonal very, very quickly. I can have knight d3, and if rook f3, knight f2 check is sufficient. And that cuts off the king from supporting, that cuts off the rook from supporting the bishop. So, yeah, so it was definitely a winning position regardless. But knight b5 creates some more chances. And now I went bishop a6. I thought this was an important move. The point is I just want to get this knight off the board. And if I'm able to get this knight off the board, I think I can convert pretty easily. Now, I was offering white to win a pawn. So if bishop e5, d5, rook takes e5, he actually is only 1 pawn down as opposed to 3 pawns down like the position we looked at before. But again, here, the fact that I have the 2 bishops is just too significant a factor in this position. And I thought that with the 2 bishops and a pawn up, this should just be a pretty easy technical task. So after knight b5, bishop a6, white went rook b2, challenging my bishop on b4. And I just went bishop c5, and my bishop on c5 is such a good piece because it protects both of my weak pawns on d6 and b6, and it kind of keeps the king in jail. This king, by virtue of my pawn structure and my bishop here, just really can't get activated, and that makes trying to defend this position a lot harder. So after bishop e2, I now went knight d7, challenging this bishop on f6, and after bishop h4, I finally went bishop takes b5. And my point is now I'm 2 pawns up, and I've evicted this bishop on h4, so there aren't going to be any serious mating threats. And the issue for white is that it's going to be difficult to activate the light squared bishop to full effect because my pawn structure is limiting the bishop's scope. So I figured even though white has the bishop pair, it's not going to feature heavily in this position, and all types of exchanges favor black. So the rest, frankly, is just a matter of technique. Now, rook takes b5 was played, and I this move, I get that, you wanted to not allow d5 perhaps, but actually after rook takes b5, you can just see how pathetic this bishop is behind its own c-pawn. This diagonal is shut down for it, and this one is shut down, and this one is shut down, so it's very difficult for the bishop to even play, the e2 bishop to play. So anyways, I went rook a8, activating my rook b1, and now knight e5, and you can see how my knight's doing an excellent job of controlling this bishop on e2. Bishop f1 was played, and that's a really sorry move because it's so passive, right? Now this bishop is relegated to the back rank and just a very, very poor position, and now I can slowly improve. I went king g7 to stop bishop f6, bishop g3, and now rook a3, challenging this bishop on g3. Bishop e1, knight d3, challenging the bishop on e1 again. Bishop h4, f6, slowly encroaching forward. King h2, g5. And now, basically, this bishop on f1 is already locked out of the game by my pieces. And now the bishop on h4, I'm slowly encroaching on its diagonals on the dark squares. So it's going to have less and less space to operate on. And after bishop g3, I went h4, and you could just see this bishop is getting choked out. There's really only one square it can go to. And after bishop e1, I played knight takes e1. And the reason I did this is because even though it's an opposite-colored bishop position, the point is that with the rooks on the board and with me being 2 pawns up and with this king now being in jail because this king can't get out of this box because my bishop is covering g1 and my pawn is covering g3. He basically has no moves. And so it's going to be very, very difficult and pretty much impossible to hold this. And after rook takes e1, I just have to slowly encroach. So now I went f5, rook d1, king f6, bishop e2, rook a2, bishop f3, rook c2, attacking c4, bishop d5, and now bishop f2. Just a very, very cruel move. And the point is my bishop is prophylactically defending against rook f1 because I want to push g4. And the point is with bishop on f2, I can also entertain bishop g3 at some point and rook c1 mate. So I basically tie the rook to the first rank because of this bishop g3, rook c1 construction. So very, very unfortunate. After rook b1, I went king e5. And after bishop g8, king f4. And you could just see I can slowly improve. And there's just nothing white can do. After rook f1, I went king e5 back. And after rook b1, I went rook d2. And my point was now that in some lines I might even consider rook takes d5 if the bishop went to d5. But that's not necessary. I'm just sort of showing that it's possible. Anyway, king h1 was played, and now I went g4. And yeah, he's just totally, this king is just totally dominated, has no scope whatsoever, huge problem. After h takes g4, f takes g4, there are new mating ideas where my king can walk to g3, my bishop can pop out to c5, and then in some lines I have rook h2 mate. So, yeah, it's just too much here. White went bishop f7, king f4, bishop d5, and now I went b5, which I think is a really, really nice touch. Very, very cruel touch, but a nice touch. And the point is that you can't play c takes b5 because the bishop is hanging, and you can't play rook takes b5 because of rook d1 mate. So that was the other reason I went rook d2, was to kind of sit on this bishop d5 move, which I thought may be a possibility. After bishop g8, I just went b4, and this is another element to it that, again, he can't take on b4 because of rook d1 and bishop g3 mate. And because of that, now the b pawn that was a backward pawn is all of a sudden a passed pawn, and that's a problem. After bishop f7, I now just went bishop c5 back. And the beauty of this move is now I'm protecting the b4 pawn and the d6 pawn, protected and passed. And I can just march my king up the board if need be, or I can entertain playing h3 and rook h2 mate like I discussed. So pretty much there's nothing that can be done. And because of that, Tianqi actually resigned. Now, one sample line just to kind of show you would be, let's say, bishop g8, h3, g takes h3, and g3, and rook h2 mate is just unavoidable. So that would be the game. And yeah, it was quite the game to play. I was quite happy to, bring an aggressive mood to the game and actually cash in on that aggressive mood. If you followed any of the games on this channel, you know that I'm typically playing very positionally, and it was nice to be able to play aggressively and actually work, because tactics aren't necessarily my strong suit. So really, really happy with that. And just the fight in this tournament, because all of a sudden I end the tournament on +1 when it easily could have gone the other way, and I'm just super grateful that it didn't. So, because as we know, I've been there before. So just had some luck on my side and played decently in good moments, and +1 was a result I will definitely take given the start of the event. So anyways, that's it for this tournament. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.